Welcome to our podcast, Deep Dive, MTR Explores Subsea Technology. I'm your host, Rhonda Moniz, and this is your portal to the latest news on all things subsea technology. This episode is brought to you by the publishers of Marine Technology Reporter, the world's largest circulation publication serving the global scientific, defense, and offshore energy subsea market. For more information, visit marinetechnologynews.com. So hello everyone and welcome to this next episode of Deep Dive. I'm super excited. We have Victor Vescovo on with us and I've been really looking forward to this. And you know, anybody in this industry knows who Victor is, but I'm going to give a little bit of intro here. So Victor has served in the Navy. He served as a reserve intelligence officer in the United States Navy and he retired with the rank of commander. He co-founded an Insight Equity Holdings, which is a private equity firm, and he's a pretty brilliant businessman, as we all know. He's also an amazing philanthropist and explorer, and he is renowned for completing several things. One, the Explorer's Grand Slam. So if you're not familiar with that, that includes climbing the highest peaks on each of the 7 continents and skiing to both the North and South Poles. And for Deep Dive here, of course, we're all interested in his work in ocean exploration. He is one of the pioneers of contemporary ocean exploration, and he has been part of or done the 5 Deeps expedition. And basically, he went to the deepest points of all 5 oceans, and that's the Atlantic, the Southern, the Indian, the Pacific, and of course the Arctic. And we're going to start out talking about that because Victor is a very proficient in technically and with technology, and he has created or built, along with Triton, a manned 2-seat submersible called the Limiting Factor. So for all you Dune fans out there, you know where that comes from. And I'm super excited to have him here today. And Victor, welcome to Deep Dive, first of all. Thank you for being here. And I thought maybe we could start by talking about the 5 Deeps expedition and the limiting factor and how that all came about.
Sure. Well, first off, thanks for having me here and being able to share some history and some other things with your audience. But the 5 Deeps expedition, that is something that started way back in about 2015 or 2016. And I was coming off the tail of what had been about a 25 year mountaineering kind of career on the side, apart from my business career and my Navy career. And as happens in mountaineering, you start getting a little bit older, a little bit slower, and you think of maybe there are other things I could do that might be a little safer, but still no less challenging. And at about that time, I had heard that Richard Branson had tried to organize something he called the 5 Dives. But to do that, a vessel was needed to take him and someone else down to those extremely deep depths where the pressure can get up to 16,000 pounds per square inch. And for a variety of reasons, most of them technical, they were not able to proceed with that plan, and the project was basically set aside. But I thought, if you approach the problem a bit differently with different technology, it should be possible. So I did what I do in my business career, which was I just applied some math and some common sense and talked to some experts in the field. And I realized it would be expensive, but it was technologically possible. And I come from a culture here in Texas where, if someone else isn't doing it, why don't you do it? Some of the most dangerous words, I think, are how hard could it be? And that began a 7-8 year project to design with Triton submarines and build the first deep diving submersible that could make repeated dives to the bottom of Challenger Deep reliably and safely and would be commercially certified, which has come up as a big topic since the disaster at the Titanic this past summer when a non-certified submersible actually imploded. Right. So we went about that whole project. I had to help design, build, and test pilot a submersible, had to buy and refit an ocean-going expedition vessel to carry the submersible everywhere, had to buy and install and calibrate a state-of-the-art sonar system, build a crew, and lead them, all the financial, insurance, all the stuff that goes along with hardcore expeditions that operates on a worldwide basis. Had to put all that together. But eventually, in the 2018 and 2019 timeframe, we were able to pull the trigger and begin the expedition, starting with the first descent to the very bottom of the Atlantic Ocean. And that was 2/3 of full ocean depth, or about 8,000 plus meters. So we thought we had a pretty good idea that we might be able to pull this off. And fortunately, we were able to within about 10 months. So we went around the world,
Wow.
dove to the 5 deeps, and actually dove 2 other locations that could have been the deepest points in the Indian Ocean and the Pacific Ocean, because it was not clear exactly what the deepest point was, believe it or not, but we did that. Heck, we even had to find the deepest point of the Southern Ocean because no one knew where it was. So we actually had
Wow.
to map the South Sandwich Trench and actually identify the deepest point and then dive it, which now is actually named after the submersible. It's actually called the Factorian Deep, which is
Oh,
pretty
that's
cool.
cool. That's
So that
super
was
cool.
the genesis of the 5 Deeps expedition, and my intention had always been to sell the entire system, the ship, the sonar, the robotic landers, the submersible, to a research organization or a government, because I'm a technologist. I develop technology. I like to perfect it, but I'm not a marine scientist or biologist, and I let other people do that. But COVID kind of came onto the scene, and it was very difficult to get people interested in buying the entire system because it's not a cheap system. And it took about 4 years to do that. But over that 4 years, I was able to fund it personally on a variety of expeditions all over the world across marine geology, mapping, wreck diving, and exploring new places to find new species. So it was an extraordinary 4 years, but I was eventually able to sell the system to Gabe Newell's Inkfish Marine Research Organization, and that's where it is now. It's out in the Pacific doing what it was designed to do, which is to dive deep and contribute more and more to marine science.
He's in New Zealand, right?
He's actually an American, born in, I think, raised in Seattle. He was one of the first people to develop the Windows operating system at Microsoft, and then he split off and built the Steam gaming distribution network. So he's a multi-billionaire, and he can much more easily than I afford to support an ultra deep diving research platform.
Wow, that's amazing. It's interesting because to be able to pull all that off in the time frame that you guys did, and to be able to do all of those dives, it was incredible. You've been to the Mariana Trench now how many times?
I've been to the bottom of Challenger Deep 15 times.
Wow. Wow. It's just I know, because when you think about it, when you put it together and you think about it, we were just I was just at the Explorers Club in New York for that talk, the panel that you were on in Jodica. And, it's when you think about the first dive to the Mariana Trench happened like 60 years ago, and they expected to go back 2 years later, which I didn't even realize that. And then they didn't go back for how many decades after, and you went and did that dive, 15 times. And I think in 1 week, I thought you did it like 3 times in 1 week, right?
Well, the
Which,
system went down 4 times in 1 week. I did 2 of the dives, and then the builder, Patrick Leahy, did the other 2. But it all comes down to the technology. Yeah, the first dive was in the Trieste, which was a bathyscaphe, which was
right.
basically a big balloon, and it went down, got to the bottom, stayed 15 minutes, and really could maneuver, and then it came back up, and that was captained by Don Walsh, and Jacques Picard was with him.
Right.
And then the next dive, you're right, it wasn't until 42 years later when James Cameron developed, built, and piloted his own submarine down to the bottom of Challenger Deep. But the submersible had some issues and it never dove again. So, what the big change that we did was we designed it from the outset to be very reliable, to be 2-person. It was the first titanium sphere. The previous 2 had been steel. That made it a lot more expensive, but in a way more durable. And it was just a more advanced submersible. It was the 3rd generation of full ocean depth technology. And because of that, we were able to dive multiple times relatively frequently. So when you think about it, 3 people had been to the bottom of Challenger Deep before we started diving in 2018. And now I think about 25 or 30 people have been to the bottom. It was the old expression that more people literally had walked on the moon than had been to the bottom of the ocean. But with the system that Triton submarines built and I helped pilot, that's no longer true. And I'm very proud of that because that's how technology should be. In the same way that Elon Musk with SpaceX, before he did it and his organization did it, landing a rocket booster was just seen as insanely hard. And not even NASA tried to do that. And he put the team together, and with private money and private determination, they made it happen. And now they land two boosters at the same time within a couple hundred meters of each other. It's extraordinary.
Right. I actually was watching a video of that the other day, and I was like, oh my God, that's insane.
Yep.
And that's the impetus behind a lot of what you do is to make it so that, like you were mentioning with Inkfish and your system, being able to make it so that scientists and researchers have access to these vessels and these deep sea submersibles to be able to do that research and to be able to do that kind of work, which I think is really incredible. It's remarkable, the stuff that you're doing. And also, that the limiting factor was used. You continued after the Five Deeps expedition and went on to use, before you sold it. You went on to do a number of other expeditions, including basically finding. I mean, I've been out on expeditions where it's like finding a needle in a haystack, and to find such a small vessel as well. And I know what it's like to not. I've been in submersibles, but my background is as an ROV pilot. But I know what it's like to, take the 4 or 5 hours with an ROV to get down to 4,000 plus meter depths, and see something that no one else has set their eyes on. Some of the stuff I was doing was, over 2,000 years old, and people haven't seen it since the day it sank. And I think it's really remarkable because of the story about specifically the CMEB and your expedition and how you guys found that was pretty intense. I was actually watching the video and I was like, oh my God, it's just such an important wreck and ship and a courageous story behind it. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, sure. Yes. And as you said, after the original Five Deeps expedition, it really was a case of, well, what else can we do that really showcases the capabilities of this amazing platform? Not just the submersible, but the sonar, the landers, the crew, everything we had going on. And so we dove, I took Prince Albert of Monaco down to the bottom of the Mediterranean at Calypso Deep. And that had a deep impact on him because we saw more human contamination at the bottom of that trench than any other place I've ever seen on the planet.
Wow.
And I was able to take technically a head of state to see that. And he was there. And that also gets into the discussion of, well, why do we need human occupied vehicles? ROVs can do everything. Well, no,
Right.
they can't. They can't.
Right.
They're complementary. When you put people in a submersible and take them in the actual locations and they can see it with their own eyes, it's an incredibly different experience. And not only that, one reason we were able to locate the Sammy B and the other ship that we found the year before, the Johnston, was because we were diving in areas ROVs can't go. The
Right.
ROVs that were looking for the Johnston couldn't go beyond 6,000 meters because the cables get too long. Well, why don't you use an automated ROV or something like an AUV? And the answer there is, well, how do you program it to actually find and then, heaven forbid, survey a wreck that could have cables, or it's a very dynamic environment. So when you're going really deep and you're going into a semi-dynamic environment, a human-occupied vehicle is actually the best solution. That's exactly what we did. We weren't interested in going down and finding wrecks at 500 meters or 1,000 meters. ROVs do that great. But if you're going to 8,000, 9,000 meters like we were, an HOV was. So what was happening was we were diving for the first time in the Philippine Trench, which was a scientific and mapping mission. And we executed that with a local scientist from the Philippines, Dr. Dio Onda, who's wonderful. But we were right next to the battlefield off Samar, which is where the epic battle took place in 1944 that involved the Johnston and the Samuel B. Roberts and some other ships. An incredible last stand by the U.S. Navy. Some say one of the greatest naval last stands in human history. It's easily in the top 5. And we did not have an AUV or an ROV to actually search the seafloor. So we used another method, which was extensive historical analysis, an incredibly detailed sonar map of the area of the battle, And from that information, we were able to localize roughly where we thought we should dive with the submersible. And then we basically used the submersible as an ROV running tracks with a sonar. In fact, for the Sammy B expedition, we had developed the deepest diving side scan sonar that's ever been developed. We had a good 200 to 300 meter range at
Wow.
8,000 meters, which had never been done before. And with that, we were able, after just 3 dives, and again, I give a lot of credit to Park Stevenson, our historian on the ship, who helped us with the mapping. We were able to find the Johnston in 2021 and then the Sammy B in 2022. So we were 2 for 2 on our expeditions, finding the 2 deepest shipwrecks in history, which I think is a great testament to the crew, to our methodology, and to the system. But it was an incredible experience.
And I agree with you, by the way, having been involved with both ROVs and HOVs, or human occupied vessels, manned submersibles. I agree with you 100%. There's nothing like being there. It's like the difference. I always like to tell people it's like the difference between watching the Super Bowl at home and being at the Super Bowl.
Yeah,
It's 2 different things, completely 2 different
right.
experiences. And by taking people, especially dignitaries and people in government and politics that make those decisions, by taking them, because I had the same experience when we were doing some stuff in the Black Sea, and you would see these like ancient amphoras, and then next to them would be garbage, like today's garbage. And it was so upsetting and made me so angry. And there's nothing like being there and seeing stuff to really have an impact on people, I think. And so I agree with you 1,000% on that. And and you bring up a really good point with that, but also with the fact that the ROVs can't get to some of those depths. And when I was taking a look at the stuff you guys did with the Sammy B, I was amazed. And I'd love to know a little bit more about the side scan sonar. I saw how you had it on the bottom of the submersible, and you developed that specifically for that expedition. That was pretty remarkable to me. And that's the other thing too that is so cool about what you do is, like a lot of us, when you're out there, you have to develop tools to make things happen. And you did that with the side scan sonar. What were some of the different challenges you had doing that? And what were some of the outcomes as far as the technology?
Well, it's always a process. You never get to where you want to go right off the bat. So we worked with Deep Ocean Search in France to develop a side scan sonar that could work at full ocean depth. And we were always pushing the technology because 98% of the ocean is shallower than 6,000 meters. So commercial industry doesn't really build anything that can really go below 6,000 meters. That's why almost every ROV, the deep ones, they bottom out at 6,000. Who needs to go that extra 2%? Well, people
Right.
like me. So we said, could we adapt an existing sonar to go to that depth? And so you have to, first off, pay the money to do that independent research and development. And unfortunately, there aren't that many people, it seems, that are willing to write 5-6 figure checks to do development just for the sake of doing development because it's interesting. There's no profit motive for industry, and government is incredibly slow moving, and they often don't pursue these projects anyway. So we worked with them. The original design specification for the side scan was actually to be 1 kilometer in swath width, if not
Wow.
1.5. Well, we had version 1, and when you put something in the water and you actually use it, stuff comes up. So it turned out that we had a lot of electronic interference in the circuits that we couldn't easily get around. So we were limited to about 200 or 300 meter, but that was still 2 to 3 times more than we had on the existing sonar. Now, when we were looking for the Sammy B, and I would like to add that the Sammy B was at a depth that was more than twice the depth of the Titanic, and it's a wreck that's more than 10 times smaller. So it was actually really hard. I don't think people get that. But one technique that is very useful for finding wrecks, pioneered by Bob Ballard in the Titanic, is, and it's a bad euphemism, but it's the best expression, which is you find the blood trail. You find
Right.
debris. Once you find a single piece of debris that you can identify as part of the wreck, okay, now you need to follow it and find the next one, and then the next one, and track that back to the main wreck. Now, when we were looking for the Johnston, that's exactly what we did. And then we found out where it slid down a ravine, and we followed that trench and we got to the wreck. The Sammy B was different. We were actually looking for the carrier, Gambier Bay.
Right.
when we found debris from the Sammy B. And then people ask, well, how did you know it was from the Sammy B? Well, I wasn't the pilot. Tim McDonald was the pilot on that dive because we rotated, and he found a triple torpedo mount embedded in the seafloor. Well, there's only one ship in the whole battle that sank that had a triple mount. And it was the Sammy B. So we knew we were close. I mean, it couldn't float 100 miles. We knew we were close. So then on the next dive, I got to go in the sub, and I had Jeremy Moizet of France next to me, who was the sonar operator, who incidentally had found the Endurance within the same year. I mean, he had a good year.
Yep.
And from that piece of wreckage, we looked at the topography from the sonar map. We looked at the currents. We really put some thought into it. Okay, which direction do we go to find the Sammy B? And I don't know if it's luck or good analysis or something, but I swear we got to the bottom and we went on a vector, and within 15 minutes, we started getting good sonar readings on the main wreck and went
That's
right to it.
amazing.
And there it was. So yeah, it was an incredible experience. And you can see it on YouTube. I actually uploaded the whole dive on YouTube. You can watch it real time and see what happened and what we were saying as we found the wreck.
I saw it. It's pretty. I recommend everybody look it up and take a look. It's really, really cool. It's I watched it a couple of times actually. It's really cool. It just gives me goosebumps every time I see something like that and hear the because I know how much work, I know how much goes into it. I've been a part of expeditions and it's incredible. It takes everyone. It's a team to get all that done, and it's amazing. But you also have some future work that you're interested in doing that involves mapping.
Mhm.
And your goal is to map basically, the planet's ocean floor.
Well,
Can
not
we,
by myself, for God's sake.
well, that's a big job. Can,
Yeah,
can you talk a little bit about that?
sure. Most people and your listeners might find it humorous, but I knew absolutely nothing about mapping or the seafloor, 7, 8 years ago. But it became part of the project of the Five Deeps because we had to find 4 of the 5 Deeps. So we had to get a Kongsberg EM124 sonar, the most powerful sonar you can put on a civilian vessel, on the bottom of my ship. So I had to learn a little bit about sonar. And we had sonar operators on the ship mapping the seafloor wherever we went. And I have to admit, I kind of got, bit by the bug a little bit because I love maps. I love cartography. I just never thought about just how much there is underwater. And now I realize, 75% of the ocean is completely unmapped. And that's very exciting to me. So now that I've sold the diving system, I've really gotten involved in the JEBCO initiative to try and map the rest of the seafloor. It's not going to happen by 2030, I'm afraid. It'll take a little bit longer. But I'm applying the same techniques I used on the dives to, well, how can we make it more efficient to map the seafloor? And so my current goal is actually to design and build a vessel that is absolutely dedicated and optimized to map the seafloor. And what I've been told by many experts in the field is that actually has never been done before. What typically happens is that people build research vessels that can do a variety of things. They can launch ROVs, they can do scientific analysis, they have berthing for 30 or 40 people, including 10 scientists, and those tend to be 50, 100, even $200 million ships. So they're very expensive to operate, and they, move relatively slowly and all this. The ship that I'm now designing is built around the sonar. You start with the sonar, and then you try and have it minimally crewed to completely reduce the cost. All this thing is going to do is just map the seafloor like nothing else. Well, then people say, as they always do, well, why don't you just use robots? Well, robots tend to be much smaller than a ship, and therefore the sonar has to be smaller. So it can't cover the same amount of area. So it's not as cost effective. Sometimes simpler or crewed vessels are still the best solution. And that's where my thinking has taken me. So I'm hoping in the next 2.5 years or so, this ship will actually be designed and built. And we will be able, if it meets its design specs, which I really believe it can, it could map 100,000 square kilometers a month. And if you have
Wow.
3 or 4 of these vessels out there mapping, now you're talking about mapping the seafloor within 20 or 30 years, not 100. And it's because you need specialized vessels. Anyway, so that's one thing I'm very passionate about. I'm deeply involved in that with many, many other things, but that's what I'm doing on the mapping side.
That's incredible, and to do something like that in 30 years as opposed to 100 years, I mean, and it does make sense, to build something, and I was, thinking about that earlier. When you are working as I've worked with a lot of scientists and engineers and, all great people, but they have their focus on what they wanna do, whereas, for somebody it's fascinating to me to have someone like you who is a businessman and years ago, one of my degrees is in business management, and somebody asked me, "Well, that's odd. Why don't you have a degree in marine biology or something like that?" And I said, "Because everything's a business."
Yeah, it
When
is.
you when
Well,
you
it's
get
about
down
the
to it.
right. It's about the use of resources
Yep,
economically. And so many people involved in the marine industry are from government or from academia. And this is not a diss on them at all. They're trained in the science, they're trained in administration, and they can do great things. But I come from a ruthless background of business cost effectiveness. So when I looked at mapping, everybody just defaulted to, well, this is how you build a research ship, this is how you operate a sonar. And I said, no, that's the way. For example, back in the 1700s, you would make a gun, you'd have a craftsman, and they would build them one by one. And yes, it got done, but it was very expensive. I try to look at it like Eli Whitney, who made the first mass production system. How do you mass produce mapping? And
right.
that's something that is an angle that I had never heard someone ask that question, but for me, it was natural. And so I said, well, strip away everything you don't have to have if all you're doing is mapping. And you end up with a very unconventional solution, which is a dedicated trimaran mapping vessel that has a crew of one or two people.
Right, right. I know that's why I'm always fascinated when you give a talk or a presentation because I just think that it's an interesting and different way of looking at things, and I think it's more viable in a lot of instances, coming at that from another angle. As the blue economy grows globally, Marine Technology Reporter has the world's largest audited subsea audience. MTR offers insights and analysis from researchers, innovators, and thought leaders in ocean subsea commerce, defense, and academia. At MTR, we always stay one step ahead. For more information on how you can stay on the cutting edge, go to www.marinetechnologynews.com. So, Victor, I know you've got a lot of different projects going on, and you're a very busy man, obviously. So, could you tell us a little bit about what some of the those other projects are in the marine-related field? What you have going on?
Sure. Most people ask if I'm developing another submersible, and the answer is yes, but that's probably more of a 4 or 5 year project because if I develop and build another submersible, I'd like for it to be a true next step forward in technological evolution. In many respects, a fourth generation full ocean depth capable submersible. And some of those technologies that I'd like to incorporate haven't even been invented yet. So that might take a couple of years. And then I'd like to
Well,
incorporate them. So in the meantime, I know I can definitely pursue the mapping vessel. And to be quite frank, that would then allow me to have a vessel that I could go and map the areas that the submersible would then eventually go dive in. So kind of breaking the problem into two parts, which I didn't do before, which was less efficient. But no, I am looking at different ideas, different configurations, how to make it more affordable, how to make it more capable, typical technological evolution stuff, which is what I do in my day job as a venture capitalist and private equity guy.
and what do you see as talking about looking towards the future? What do you see as in the ocean technology realm? What do you see as some things coming down the pike, or some things you'd like to see develop? Some maybe new tools that would be of value, or what direction do you see the future of the industry?
Well, there are a couple. There are some very tactical things that I'm working on. For example, I think we already spoke about the side scan sonar. I'd like to get it up to like a 1 or 2 kilometer swath width. So even at full ocean depth, one can see what's on the bottom of the ocean. You're not
Right.
looking through a straw. I also really want to increase the technology with cameras and screens so that even at full ocean depth, you can have a virtual experience of being able to look outside and not looking through incredibly small portholes. But more generally, I think the most important thing is just simply to increase the economy of it. It's incredibly expensive to dive in the ocean, and we need to work harder and better to find out ways to get more people in the ocean, more data retrieved, and have more people able to experience it. Because when people go into the ocean and they see how amazing it is, I think they get touched by it, and then they want to support research more. They want to be more involved. They realize how much pollution goes into the ocean. Accessibility is a big issue, and that's something that the community has not really, I think, done the best job at, because it really wasn't a priority. It was just getting in there in the first place. So that's one area. The other is, I think there's a tendency for there to be a lot of really big, really expensive oceanographic research vessels. But in so many areas where I've talked to scientists, they said, no, we need more, less expensive vessels distributed all over the world so we can collect more data from more places. That actually is more valuable than having, several $100 million research vessels that can only be at one place at one time. And so
Right.
I think there's some movement to do that, but you do need both. So it's just any number of things to reduce the cost of ocean exploration so we can do more of it.
And you're involved also, obviously, in ocean education, STEM, conservation, different things of that nature. And you talk a lot. You've talked about you know being able to kind of take a different approach towards this, and I mean that makes perfect sense to me, obviously, to be able to be able to cover a larger area as opposed to just focusing on one small area. Are you also I know you're also doing interested, one of your passions is mapping. Are you also going to start looking at some different shipwrecks, or looking for, are you going to go back and look for any of the there's the one that when you were looking for the Sammy B, you were originally
Yeah.
looking for the carrier. Are you guys going to
Yeah.
go back and look for that, or?
Oh, yeah. I absolutely would love to do that, especially if you have a side scan sonar that has a much increased range. It becomes easier to actually scan the seafloor. And I'd also like to develop ultra deep diving AUVs, which is also something that really doesn't exist, at least not in any volume. So the idea is to create the technology so it's still cost effective, but allows you to do these other missions. I'd love to continue the wreck searches for the Gambier Bay, for the Hole, for the Japanese wrecks that are there. There are a lot of wrecks that are very deep that have not been located. And that's more interesting, especially since Paul Allen died, who was the real provider for the community that was looking for World War II and other wrecks. Someone has to take up that mantle, and I'd love to be able to help out as much as I can. But then there's also, of course, the marine research, the nuts and bolts, going down into trenches, finding hydrothermal vents, looking for new species, and doing all that other legwork that is so important to marine research and climate modeling research.
Now, this is a little bit of a side note, but a project that I've been kind of interested in is, what is your take on the Amelia Earhart stuff?
No, well, who knows? I think they have
Right,
found
right,
something. They have found something interesting on the seafloor. I don't know if it's her Electra or not. It could be a Japanese bomber from World War II. You don't know until you get eyes on target. That's just how it
right,
is. And
right,
it's great that the attempts are being made, that people are spending their own money to try and find these wrecks. Because what's cool is people say, well, who cares about wrecks in the bottom of the seafloor? Well, the issue is if you find them, it is an exciting story, and it allows you an opportunity to tell people about the story, whether it's about what
right.
happened with the heroic crew of the Sammy B, or the heroism and the incredible life that Amelia Earhart led. Finding her her aircraft would be an amazing ability to tell people about her great story.
I agree, and I think that a big part of why people are so fascinated, when especially something like that where she went missing, and obviously there's a lot of different theories, and it's just fascinating. It's a little bit of a detective story, a little bit
Mhm.
of history based on who she was, and you're right, it does get people interested in exploration, in the technology used in the exploration, and
Mhm.
a lot of other things. So I think it's an interesting story. I know a couple of the guys that have been out there for different, different of expeditions looking for her, and it's fascinating. So there's always really cool stuff going on. What about the Arctic and the the poles? Have you thought about doing any? I know probably mapping, but have you thought about doing any more exploration there? Or
Well, operating the Arctic or Antarctic is even more difficult. Not if it's difficult enough operating even in the temperate latitudes. I really don't have particular goals in terms of Antarctic expeditions, but I am actually quite interested in the Arctic with the receding uh, ice scape up there. And there are also some trenches in the Arctic Ocean that just haven't had a lot of exploration. And part of that is because they're covered by ice. But one of the beneficial impacts of climate change is that they are becoming more accessible and they are rather interesting. So there's one trench, the Gackle Trench or Gackle Ridge, that has been very unexplored by any civilians. I'm sure the military has done a bit down there because that's where the submersible submarines actually jockeyed around during the Cold War. But I would love to go up to the Gackle Trench and map that one. It's a very long trench. It's completely unexplored. So things like that. And there's certain to be different wildlife there. I know that the Malloy Deep, the deepest point in the Arctic Ocean that I was fortunate enough to visit, was amazing just in terms of the amount of wildlife and how rugged the terrain was. It was a very exciting dive, let me put it that way. And our scientists on board were just fascinated by what we saw there.
the Arctic's on my bucket list, Victor. I just want to let you know that, just in case, if you need an extra body or something, just throwing that out there.
Sure. I've had a lot of people say that they'd be very excited to come on an expedition up to the Arctic with me.
I bet. I bet. Oh,
Well, the other thing that I'm deeply involved in is just what I'm involved in on the venture capital side, because exploration doesn't necessarily have to be strapping into a deep diving submersible or even climbing a mountain. There are so many more opportunities for people to explore in other fields. For example, science and technology that I'm very passionate about. One of the companies that I've invested in recently actually is trying to de-extinct the woolly mammoth. It's called Colossal Biosciences. So we have an amazing team of scientists led by George Church of Harvard, who was a principal investigator on the Human Genome Project. And we believe it's really a matter of engineering at this point to bring back species that have died. That's an incredible adventure in its own right that doesn't take place, with Gore-Tex out in the wild, but it does take place in a lab. And it's no less exciting, and the achievement would be amazing. And then there are other things. I'm also involved in a company that is attempting to do deep space exploration and eventually mine asteroids. Now that is really out there, but that's
that
another
is.
form of, yeah, but that's another form of exploration that I just
Mm-hmm.
go by my mantra. If it doesn't violate the laws of physics, it's a matter of engineering and
Right.
resources, of course. So one day we are going to bring back species. One day we're going to mine asteroids. And if not us starting the ball rolling, who else? People need to get off the couch, get out of their phones, and live real lives in the real world, advancing us as a species. That is, in my view, what has solved more problems of humankind, has made life more bearable. It's the development of technology, and that only happens with people that are educated, that are pushing it to its limits. And yes, there will be failures. There always are. But from the failures, we learn. And from that, we actually are able to move forward.
Yeah, I in you mentioned failures. Last year's Titan expedition was one of those unfortunate failures. I wonder what your thoughts are on that.
Well, that was a situation like with any technology development. You're always going to have people that are really pushing further and further. And there's sometimes a very hazy line between methodical progress at the ragged edge of technology development and then becoming reckless. And
Right.
sometimes it's not clear to the participants who's reckless and who is being relatively safe or as safe as you can be. And I think in the case of the Titan, that they were operating in that region that was unfortunately beyond any reasonable assumption of safety, and that a lot of it was being driven by commercial need because they needed to make it profitable so they can continue to invest and develop the technology and also run the trips. And that unfortunately caused them to compromise safety. And you just can't have that.
Right.
And you don't take paying passengers on experimental craft. That's just
Right.
a priori not a good thing to do.
Right. Yeah. No, it's true that, the, advances in technology, it takes getting out there and doing it and taking those chances, but you can't exactly, you can't be taking people along as paid customers to support that, advancement and, have experimental systems where you're putting people's lives at risk. I agree.
Yeah.
So what the next big thing that's on the list next is the development of the submersible and the development of the vessel for mapping. Those are the next
Yeah.
two big things.
Yeah, for me, it's the mapping vessel is kind of right front and center, but I'm also doing something completely different. I'm also I'm trying to develop a high altitude aircraft that's actually piston powered. That's a whole separate thing that I'm just interested in because I've been flying aircraft since I was 19. So I don't think I've ever been bored in my life. So at
I
any
was gonna
given
say,
time, at any given time, I have multiple projects underway, and that doesn't even get into the different business things that I'm involved in. So, you know, one thing I like is that many of them done correctly take years to gestate and then reach their fruition. Most people don't get that. They just see the headline when you do something. They don't realize the years of work and ups and downs to get to that point. But if you have good teams underneath you and you can provide the resources, you can do multiple things at the same time because they're burning slowly. And so
right.
that's what I like to do. So one day I'm working on marine stuff, another day I'm working on aviation stuff, another day I'm really focused on business, and that's just how I operate.
A lot of irons in the fire.
Yeah, but that's an interesting way to live, I think. Anyway, I'd be bored
I
otherwise.
yeah, I agree. I agree. So another question I have is, so what is the importance? People ask, well, why map the seafloor? What does that mean? Why care? Who cares? Why map it? Why bother? Why put all this effort and money into this? What would you say to them?
I think just at a fundamental level, it's our world. How can we live on a world with 8 billion people on it and not know the topography of basically half of the planet? 71% of planet Earth is ocean. And of that, 75% is completely unexplored. So, literally, half of our planet remains completely unexplored. Just, I know I'm an explorer, but that just bothers me. And we should know what is underneath the waves. But at a more practical level, knowing the topography of the seafloor can help us understand how the tectonic plates are interacting. And that causes seaquakes and tsunamis. And as we have seen, it can cause spontaneous explosions of volcanoes underwater, which can devastate many communities. Or the Fukushima disaster in Japan, that was caused by tectonic plates colliding, and we had very little warning. So there are practical reasons. But I think for me, in many respects, I think it's the last great true exploration on planet Earth, the last big one anyway, mapping half of our planet. We still haven't done it. And people go, oh, well, you can go on Google and you can see the seafloor on Google. Well, no, that's using satellites using magnetic readings. And that's plus or minus several kilometers sometimes. We really don't know. And so I think it's a worthwhile objective just on a human basis to understand the world that we live in.
I love that. Well, Victor, it has been a pleasure. Thank you so much for taking the time out of your busy schedule and talking to us on Deep Dive. I always like talking to you and hearing your presentations and following you and watching what you're doing. You're doing some incredible work, and you truly are a pioneer. And so it's an honor actually
Oh,
to be able to talk to you. And so thank you so much for taking the time.
my pleasure. I'll leave you with one last thought. We talked about the mapping vessel, and that is the biggest thing on my docket right now, especially in the exploration side. It's very exciting. I'm working with Espen Unio Yachts out of Monaco, and they're probably the world leader in high-end expedition ships. And they have a interest in this because I think they see the importance of it. But I gave them this very detailed list of requirements. It needs to have this capability, this capability. It needs to be cost effective on these dimensions. But the last major bullet point that I put in the requirements document was that it has to look cool. Because
Hey,
at the end of the day, if you're going to be out there on the ragged edge of technology or adventuring, you want to look cool.
I listen, I agree. You're not going to get an argument here. And Victor, you usually do look pretty cool, I got to say.
Whatever. I learned the bad habits from my mountaineering friends. We'd be up at altitude and we'd just be sucking wind and hungry, and the weather would be bad. And then we would, adjust our sunglasses and say, how do I look? Yeah,
I'm about to drop, but how do I look?
exactly. Come on,
That's
we go back to Shackleton and Amundsen and those guys. You knew that was in the back of their mind because hey, Helen Keller said it best: life is either a daring adventure or it's nothing at all.
true. Absolutely true. Thank you, Victor. You're awesome. Thank you so
My
much.
pleasure. Thank you. Take care.
This episode of Deep Dive was brought to you by the publishers of Marine Technology Reporter. Interested in being a guest or a sponsor for Deep Dive? For more information about this podcast and many other opportunities for your company to stay informed and in the know, go to marinetechnologynews.com. And as usual, hit like and subscribe anywhere you get your podcast. See you again on the next Deep Dive.